institution to offer ordination to women, and our 43 graduates are out in the world, as we have another 60 students who are training up to be able to support dynamic Judaism and courageous leadership in the larger international Jewish community. So we're just so happy to be here and so excited for Darshanit Udel's new book and to be in conversation with our former colleague, Dr. Laura Shaw-Frank.
Jen, you totally should have been the one to give their intros, but I'll steal it because I get to introduce the women of the hour who are amazing, and we are so grateful for the time that they're spending with us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're coming from. Darshanit Dr. Miriam Udel is an associate professor of German studies and Jewish studies at Emory University, where her teaching focuses on Yiddish language, literature, and culture. She was ordained as clergy in 2019 at Yeshivat Maharat. She has authored Never Better, The Modern Jewish Picturesque, winner, ooh, that's exciting, I didn't know, winner of the 2019 National Jewish Book Award in Modern Jewish Thought and Experience. Amazing. And the reason that we're all together today, honey on the page, which I'm sure you'll tell us a little bit more about in a moment. Miriam, thank you so much for joining us from Atlanta and giving us this wonderful excuse to gather together today. Dr. Laura Shaw-Frank is the Director of Contemporary Jewish Life at AJC, the American Jewish Committee, where she works on Israel diaspora relations, Israel education, Jewish literacy, and American Jewish communal life. She is a passionate Jewish educator who I've loved seeing in action personally, and actually shares this amazing, delightful connection with Miriam through her own previous work at Yeshivat Maharat, and she's joining us today from New York. I am thrilled to hand this over to Laura so that we can jump in and stop listening to me talk. Again, a reminder to please use the chat feature so that we can talk to each other and let us know who and where you are.
Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here and so excited to be in conversation with my friend Miriam, who I've known for many, many years. I just want to start out by saying that I thought a lot about what adjective I was going to assign to this book, and the word that comes to my mind is delicious. It's a delicious book. It is funny and warm and pushes buttons in all kinds of wonderful ways, and it's fascinating and it's illuminating and it's just warm. It's just a wonderful, delicious book. So I'm so excited to be in conversation with you today about it, Miriam. I want to start out by giving our audience some background because many of them may not be familiar with the book. This is a book of Yiddish children's stories. It's an annotated book. I'm sure you'll speak more about that, where you give a little bio about the author and then the stories which you yourself translated. And we're going to talk a little bit more about translation later. What made you embark on a project of a book of children's stories?
Sure. So first, I just want to say thank you to the sponsoring organizations. This is a very meaningful trifecta for me. Maharat is home spiritually and intellectually. JOFA is actually the place where, I don't know if Laura even remembers this, but in 1997, I was a little Pisher undergraduate and I attended the first JOFA conference, and Laura was one of the cool, you know, older women with a career thinking big thoughts, and I made a beeline for her, and that's actually when we started getting to know each other after that. And of course, Svivah represents this exciting new Svivah, this new environment, this new place around her on the scene. So bringing all of these organizations together means a lot to me. So I have to take myself back to about 7 years to 2013. I had just finished the manuscript for Never Better, The Modern Jewish, it's picaresque, and if you read the book, you'll find out all about what that is. When I was casting about for a new project, I had been teaching Yiddish language, and I also had 2 kids at the time who are 7 years younger than my high schooler and my middle schooler are today, so little kids. And I wanted materials that would be authentic something in Yiddish that maybe I would want to share with my kids, something that my undergraduates could read as second semester Yiddish students. And I started wondering, is there anything? I mean, I read children's literature when I was studying Spanish and Hebrew and Arabic, and I never came across any when I was studying Yiddish. So I started searching, and I didn't have to search very far, because what I quickly found was that there was a corpus of almost 1,000 freestanding books and also periodicals, some of which had print runs for decades. And the books were all scanned and sitting on the website of the National Yiddish Book Center, free, available, like somebody come read us. So I thought, I'm gonna spend a while with these and see if it leads anywhere. And I very quickly realized that if I wanted to do this project, I would be reading a lot of really bad Yiddish children's literature, which I did, and that occasionally I would be rewarded for my perseverance by reading something fantastic. And that's what I tried to assemble in what ended up being, I think, 47 pieces in the table of contents for Honey on the Page.
Wow, that's such a story, my gosh. I can just see you going through this. I've been on the Yiddish Book Center website myself. My Yiddish is hardly called Yiddish compared to yours. It's bad. But that must have been like a wonderful treasure hunt to go through. And, you know, there must have been, I'm sure, so a lot of chaff, but then every once in a while there was that piece of gold. Yeah. Could you give us a little bit of historical context about Yiddish and also about literature for children, just to kind of frame for us a little bit about how we should think about this book?
Sure. So Yiddish was the language, the lingua franca of Eastern European Jewry for about 1,000 years, from about the turn of one millennium to the turn of the next millennium. And it develops when Jews are living in the area that's now mostly Germany, and it moves with the Jews wherever they go. So during the long 19th century, that meant moving eastward as Jews moved into Poland and the Pale of Settlement, Romania, Lithuania, areas that are now Russia. And then around the turn of the 20th century, that meant migrating globally with the Jewish people as Eastern European Jews migrated to the Americas, to Canada and the United States and Latin America, to South Africa, to Australia, to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel. Basically anywhere that Jews were going, they were carrying Yiddish with them. Now, that said, it took a really long time for Yiddish to become kind of aware of itself as a language and a vehicle for high culture. It really wasn't until the very early 20th century that there was a purposeful push to create a high culture, whether that was literature for adults or eventually for children in Yiddish. And so I've done some comparative study of children's literary traditions in Europe and in some of the other places, Anglo and American literary traditions for children. And I've really become aware of how much a children's literature is kind of stamped with the mark of its founding moment. So if you look at the Brothers Grimm in what eventually became Germany, they were ethnographers, you know, before that was a thing. They were folklorists. They were interested in collecting authentic German folklore and collecting the stories of the people. So they would sometimes sit in aristocratic salons and hear ladies of leisure recount stories. And other times they would go out into cottages and huts in the countryside and hear workers, you know, at the end of the day as they're just kind of sitting by the fire, occupying their hands with whatever needed to be done and telling stories. And we can see how the Grimm's fairy tales are really part of the kind of story of German nationalism and its formation. Jump ahead in time 100 years, 125 years, and look around at what's happening for Yiddish at the time when there starts to be a children's literature. So, like many other peoples in the world, and particularly in Europe, Jews didn't used to have age stratified literature. In other words, you didn't divide up literature according to the age of who was consuming it. There were other ways, and we can talk about those. There were ways involving gender and language and the nature of a text. But at the time when Yiddish was becoming aware of itself and founding educational systems and educational networks for its children, there was quickly a realization that those schools that they were founding needed materials that would speak to children in what felt like a modern way. And so the literature that I translate and sort of put before you in Honey on the Page very much grows out of that moment of Yiddish becoming aware of itself in tandem with becoming aware of the need to preserve itself and to create a set of texts and reading experiences that would be compelling and that would really inspire love as well as knowledge in Jewish children.
It's so interesting because I think that, you know, until you give it a minute of thought, you can look at children's books as being, you know, just for children, which not to say just for children. Children are incredibly important, and it's wonderful that there's a literature, but that they're coming out of a worldview or coming out of an agenda, whether articulated, unarticulated, realized, or unrealized. It lends all kinds of texture and depth to what it means to read a children's story. It's incredible. So having kind of given us that framework, let's kind of think a little bit, delve a little bit into the stories themselves. What agenda do you see? Whether, again, you know, I don't want to presume that the authors of these stories had an agenda in mind. Maybe some of them did, maybe some of them didn't. But what kind of messages do you see being imparted, for example, about Jewish identity or any kinds of messages that are coming out of these stories that kind of caught your eye?
Sure. So there are a lot of different ways to answer this question, and I'll try to just run us through a couple of sort of revealing examples rather than trying to, you know, address every conceivable point. I start the book, I needed a mode of organization for all of these treasures that I found in the glittering treasure cave, right? And I wanted the book to be a resource for families and for educators, not just for scholars of children's literature or scholars of Jewish history and culture. And so I decided to organize the book thematically. And then once I had that idea, I needed a way of grouping my themes that made sense, right? So there were actually some anthologies from 100 years ago, and I let those be my guide. And whether or not the anthologist talked about the modes of organization that they employed, what I saw happening again and again was books that move from the very particular and specifically or distinctively Jewish out toward the more universal and broad to work that could be just about the human condition or childhood anywhere that happened to be written in Yiddish. So at the beginning of my book, I have a section, the first of the 8 themes that I cover is Jewish holidays. And I start that with a group of 3 Sabbath tales. Now the Sabbath tales are really an interesting case because the first 2 of those talk about, they kind of create like a mini genre or a sub-genre that's a species of wonder tale. And I actually ended up becoming obsessed with this and writing an article about this. So if anyone's interested, I can give you the reference later. But what's so interesting about these tales that take as their theme a Jew who observes the Sabbath in dangerous or compromising circumstances and has to decide, am I going to keep moving on a journey, a geographical, physical journey, or am I going to stop and observe the Sabbath as best I can under these circumstances? And in both cases, one is a humble tailor, the other is a rabbi. In both cases, the protagonists decide, I'm going to stop and observe the Sabbath, and they end up being very richly rewarded. So obviously these tales are kind of celebrating the traditional observance of Shabbos. And what's so captivating to me is that both of them were written by leftists who understood themselves to be secularists, if not fully secular. One was a cultural Zionist, the other was a Bundist. So these are kind of part of the range of flavors of Jewish leftism in the early decades of the 20th century. And so we have to really step back and figure out, well, why are they writing these stories valorizing Sabbath observance? And I think that part of what we see going on is that if God owns 1/7 of your time, if you're going to turn over 1/7 of your time to observe God's mandated day of rest, then that means that the bosses, the capitalist boss who owns your factory, doesn't own that 1/7 of your time. So we see this really interesting and kind of surprising dovetailing of the leftist agenda and set of concerns with a traditionally observant set of concerns. Now, it doesn't always work that way, but I think that part of what reading this literature with our children, alongside our children, with our own levels of adult scrutiny and capacity to ask questions, I think part of what that reveals is all kinds of interesting points of tangency and connection across various, what we might normally think of as separate stripes or strands of the Jewish community. So that's one example of an agenda. And I'll just give one other quick one. A lot of these authors really wanted to embed their ideas about leftist politics, but even more so the values that underlay their politics in the story. So we have a number of stories about generosity, about acts of kindness, about how to behave humanely. And one of the aspects of the kind of modernity, the things that give these stories a modern feel, some of them have adults as the hero modeling these virtues, but some of them really make children into the heroes and the protagonists. So we see a lot of that in these stories.
Interesting. I want to go back for a second to the Shabbat stories. That I'm listening to you speak and I'm thinking, I'm also wondering if there is a piece of the famous Achad Ha'am kind of cultural Zionism idea going on here, that more than the Jewish people have kept the Shabbat has kept the Jewish people. And I'm thinking about my grandparents, my father's parents were socialists, workman's circle socialists. And when we would go to their house to visit them, my grandfather would ask us questions about the Parsha all the time. They kept a kosher home. Of course Jews keep kosher homes. Mm-hmm. Jews discuss the Parsha. So I'm wondering if you feel some of that going on in these stories.
Definitely. So, we have this beautiful resonant image from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel of the Sabbath as an island in time or a palace in time, right? So one of these stories literalizes that metaphor where the tailor who decides to keep the Sabbath literally gets to enter a marble palace that is an apparition in the middle of the forest in a blizzard. And so it's
I loved that story.
Yeah, it creates this palace in time. And I think that the authors wanted to help educate kids, not necessarily who would dwell on that island every week, because most of the families consuming these stories at the time had left behind Shabbos observance, but they wanted it to be a familiar place, and they wanted to embed a level of Jewish knowledge and feeling, not just around Hanukkah, which of course gets major billing in America, right, because of when it falls, but around Lag Boimer and Purim and all of these Shavuos, and understanding what are these holidays, what does it mean to experience the world through Jewish liturgical time, the calendar of what it really means and feels like to be a Jew.
Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense. So we're here this event is being co-sponsored by 3 women's organizations that are dedicated to the advancement of women and women's leadership and women's learning. So, and I've heard you speak of this book as being a feminist project in a way. So I would love for you to speak a little bit about that. And then I also want to then talk a little bit about Jewish childhood and Jewish womanhood. So why is this book a feminist project?
So I think that it is a feminist project in a couple of different dimensions. One, and probably most straightforwardly, is that I am retrieving the work of many female authors who have otherwise been kind of neglected. They're not all neglected. Some of them are well-known names. Anybody who's involved in Yiddish, and I see that we have some Yiddishists tuned in, will certainly know the name of Kadia Molodovsky. They might not know Rachel Shabbat's name, but they'll certainly know the name of her husband, Max Weinreich. What I wanted gender parity in my table of contents, and I wasn't able to get it, because the simple reality is that even as we, make it well into the 20th century, there are still more men publishing than women. But I tried to sort of compensate for that in other ways. So one of the treasures that I think I've unearthed in this volume and brought into English for the first time is a writer named Sina Rabinovich, who became a Zionist very early and she actually sort of contrived a Shana Aleph for herself. She went and spent a year studying in pre-state Palestine before that was a thing. And then she went back to Europe, and then she ended up moving between New York and finally Israel late in her life. And she was published very widely in Latin America, and her work was published. It was translated into Spanish and into Hebrew, but I don't think it has been before into English. So the longest single piece in the book is what we would now call a young adult novella, The Story of a Stick, a Maisa mit der Steckele, and that's by Sina Rabinovich.
That was my favorite story in the whole book. I just want to tell you. I think.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
I loved that story.
Yeah. So 4-generation, saga of Jewish history from the 1860s to 1945, right? So that is right in your wheelhouse, Laura.
Exactly. Shocker that I love it so much.
Right. But there were a few instances in which there was either inadequate or a complete lack of biographical information about my women authors. I have the 8-volume Lexikon von Jiddische Schreibers, the lexicon of Yiddish or Jewish writers, Yiddish writers, and one of them was missing. I actually got to create a lovely friendship with a man named Rav Maximo or Rav Mordechai Shechet, who is the surviving son of Polish, Cuban, American writer Malka Shechet, whom I was able to locate through the good offices of librarian superhero Amanda Miriam Chaya Siegel from the New York Public Library Dorot Division. So yay for librarians. And so really kind of tracking down the lives of these Jewish women, which in some cases I was able to do through meeting relatives. In other cases, I was able to do because these women had exceptionally literate sons who ended up publishing memoirs that spent a chapter describing their mothers. And that happened in a couple of different cases. So that's one feminist dimension. And that's the more sort of discrete one and contained, clear one. But the more diffuse feminist dimension of this project is that I think for a long time it was assumed that there was a männische Svivah and a weibersche Svivah. There was a men's sphere and a women's sphere, and that children up to a certain age would be in that women's sphere, and then boy children would sort of imprint and follow their fathers, and girl children, of course, would remain in that sphere with their mothers. And when we look at children's literature seriously, and we bring all of our adult critical lenses to thinking about the cultural materials that we place before children, it also becomes a really profound way of thinking about women's lives and what those lives look like, even when there isn't necessarily a record of material culture or textual culture that we can turn to. So that's a little bit more amorphous, but it's something that's very much on my mind, you know, as a scholar who's writing a follow-up volume that's a critical study of all of this, and also as a mother for the entire time that I was working on this project.
So you're writing a follow-up book?
I am. I'm writing a critical study. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Can't wait to read it. Wow.
Thank you. Can't wait to have time to write again.
I know. Your children will probably be in graduate school and, you know, in the next phase of life by then, or maybe you'll even be a grandmother and you can then turn this book, Honey on the Page, over to them, over to your grandchildren. I want to talk a little bit more about the kind of images of women in the book and of Jewish girls. And in particular, I just want to raise Sprinza, who is at the end of the book.
You might. I have my Sprinza illustration by Paula Cohen all ready for everyone to see Sprinza in all her glory.
There she is. I'll tell you why I relate to her. I'm sure you will not at all be shocked by this. I was the child who never could get her nose out of a book. Like, I was the one who was walking into walls because I was reading and lost in this world of books my entire childhood. So this girl who ends up at the top of a lamppost because she, you know, wanders there while she's reading and is reading, she kind of makes live what she's reading. To me, I just related to her. I loved her. And by the way, I want to make sure we save some time to talk about the illustration. So I'm holding that thought.
Okay.
But if you could talk a little bit about the images of girlhood and womanhood in the book, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So one of the most exciting innovations that takes place about 10 years into the life of this literature. So I should say that the period of major burgeoning for Yiddish children's literature was between the world wars. So it's really getting going in the teens, and then we start to see more and more publishing activity in the 20s. And then by 1935, it has totally hit its stride as a literature. And then, of course, the Holocaust comes and interrupts everything, and we do still have Yiddish children's literature after that, and it becomes really a project of cultural consolidation and preservation. But during that period, really in the 30s, there was this realization that, oh my goodness, half of our readership is girls. We need to create girl protagonists. And one of the things that I'm going to be discussing in the critical study is that just as we had at the end of the 19th century, we had this kind of proto-feminist figure who is called the New Woman, and she was really independent, and she might ride a bicycle, she might wear bloomers, she might even wear pants, right? So that she could have mobility and freedom. So too, I think it's probably her granddaughter who's what I'm calling the new girl. And one of the kind of signature markers of the new girl in Yiddish literature is that she's not where she's supposed to be at any given time. So sometimes she's getting lost, sometimes she's wandering off, right? But if she's supposed to be at home, she's somewhere else. If she's supposed to be in school, she's not in school, right? So Sprinza is definitely a favorite. Those stories, I've included the first chapter of an entire book of stories, the rest of which I would love to translate, you know, in the future, which hopefully will be long and bright. So Sprinza has this superpower that you mentioned, Laura, that she's such an intense reader that whatever is happening in the book that she's reading, she perceives to be happening in her own life. And that's the plot engine that really drives all of the kind of harmless scrapes that Sprinza gets into. So she's like the quintessential girl of Yiddish children's literature. And then there are some others, but a big thing is either getting lost or wandering off and just generally not being where you're expected to be.
I love that. I just absolutely love that. That's incredible, an incredible image. So as you were writing this book and translating the stories, I'm sure you envisioned people reading it, as we do when we're working on writing things. We imagine our reader. Who is the reader that you were imagining in your mind's eyes, or the readers that you were imagining in your mind's eye?
Yeah, so one of the things that was really difficult about getting this book published was that I had this vision that it could serve a lot of different constituencies, that it really would have the scholarly apparatus to please curious adults, whether they are specialists or general readers, but that it would also be something that a librarian or a teacher could pull out during story time when everyone's sitting on the carpet in a circle, or that it would be something that a family could enjoy. Maybe a tween or a middle schooler goes off and reads one of the stories, and the parents also pick it up and they discuss it at dinner. As a translator, I had this kind of mythical kid in South Bend, Indiana, who plucks the book off of a public library shelf. I thought a lot about this kid in deciding, how to translate things like Kiddush, the benediction over the wine on Friday night, how many glosses to put in the text, when I needed a note or when I could simply embed some question of cultural or religious explanation in the text itself. What I did not picture was the pandemic reading situation. I did not picture doing book events over Zoom. I just Zoomed into a Sunday school in Toronto this past Sunday, and I have a lot more Sunday school and Hebrew school visits lined up. So that, of course, is disappointing in all of the ways that we've been disappointed. But it also, in trying to see the silver linings, it also creates an opportunity for a different, more intimate kind of family reading experience. And I wonder, and I'm kind of hopeful that maybe more families will be building fires this winter. And maybe sitting in front of those fires, there will sometimes be family reading night, and that these that these stories and poems might furnish some of the materials for a really stimulating, thought-provoking family reading night. So that's kind of what I'm visualizing now, which is a little different than what I had in mind when I was selecting and translating.
Yeah, I think the pandemic has been such an interesting moment we're becoming more old school in some ways, in some wonderful ways. Obviously, the pandemic, we all would rather not have it. And it's been terrible, obviously, and tragic in so many ways. But over last winter, I found myself doing puzzles with my kids all the time and kind of, engaging in these kind of old school Little House on the Prairie activities. And as I've shared with you, Miriam, although my children are older, I have 2 graduate students, both living at home. I have a son in Israel this year, but my youngest is in 10th grade. Mm-hmm. I have read to them from Honey on the Page on Friday nights. And we've all enjoyed it so much. So it's even good for middle-aged moms with their 20-something and teenage kids. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, you just mentioned translation and kind of making the book accessible to the South Bend reader. But there are other issues that come up with the translation. And one thing you mentioned to me when we were talking about the book is that you wanted to, and you talk about this in the introduction, in fact, that you wanted to put more poetry in the book. But it was so difficult to access the idiomatic language that was so multi-layered in Yiddish, to translate that into English. That was a task that was simply impossible. So could you talk to us a little bit about what were the kind of successes or not successes, that's not the word I'm looking for. What were some of the magical moments of translation and what were some of the more challenging moments?
Sure. So I did actually include a good deal of rhyming verse, which also rhymes in the English.
Right.
And that was really challenging and really fun. And I think what you're alluding to is a moment in the introduction when I talk specifically about this wonderful genre of aleph-based books that were used to teach the Hebrew Yiddish alphabet. And a lot of them rhyme, and they're full of puns, and they're full of visual jokes about the appearance of the letters and what they resemble. And I found that, beyond the title for one of them, The Stinging Bee, for Der Beser Beis, which means literally means the angry letter bet or letter base, right? So I got The Stinging Bee, but I couldn't really move very far beyond that and have the letters make sense. But I did translate a lot of rhyming poetry, and there are also a lot of stories in Yiddish that move between prose and poetry, or that embed stanzas and snippets of poetry. So one of my favorite of those is by Moshe Shivres, and it's about when the alphabet got angry. And it's a little boy who goes to public school in the morning and Yiddish school in the afternoon, living probably somewhere in the environs of New York. And it's the night before the first day of school. And he realizes that when he went to the Catskills for the summer, he didn't take his Yiddish book along to practice, and he hasn't cracked open a Yiddish book all summer, and he doesn't know whether he's going to even remember how to read Yiddish. And he's very stressed out as he's falling asleep. And he has this terrible dream in which the letters of the Aleph Beis become furious at his neglect of them all summer. He didn't even let them out to breathe, and now they're going to abandon him if he doesn't, resolve to do better in the future. So that one has a happy ending. Another one that I'm very fond of, the hardest to translate, was a fairly long narrative poem in verse by Leib Kvitko about a sort of gluttonous, dirty Jewish boy who lives in the shtetl and won't take a bath. And it's kind of like the spirit of a Shel Silverstein poem, with a full enjoyment of, the senses and whatever is grimy and gross. But the difference is he's living in Soviet Russia. And so the state sends in sanitaren, they send in sanitation agents to come and grab this boy and forcibly bathe him. And it sounds very violent and it sounds a little alarming to parents, but I think that kids can appreciate the story of a kid being bathed by fiat and then ending up liking being clean.
I think any one of us who's parented children can relate to that one. We have about 1,000 questions that have come in for you, which is so exciting. So I think I'm going to turn now to some audience questions because they're so wonderful. They're just incredible questions. So here's one. Before the rise of Yiddish Kidlit, what were people reading to their children? Or were they not reading to their children? Or do you know?
So they were definitely reading to their children. And this actually gives an opportunity to address something that I had wanted to say earlier. So there was a gender stratification in the traditional Jewish world. Men who had elite education would be expected to start learning Gemara and then Halacha and continue with those discourses that were in Hebrew and Aramaic, whereas women, and in the phrase of the time, men who were like women, would read everything else. And the everything else might be the courtly adventure stories of the Bova Buch. It might be Senerena, better known as the Yiddish Women's Bible. It might be folk tales. It might be adventure stories. All of that was on the table, and whatever the non-elite adults were reading, that's what children were reading, not to mention Bible stories and various adaptations of Bible stories.
It's fascinating. What are the most resonant female identified Yiddish characters that you recall from the book? Aside from Sprinze, of course.
Aside from Sprinze. So actually, I want to give a shout out to a female character who's not in my book because it's already been translated very beautifully elsewhere. But Katja Molodowski's character, Olke mit der blauer Parasolke, Olke with the blue parasol, actually furnishes the working title for my critical study that's coming up, which I call Umbrella Sky, because Olga is a character who has this blue parasol and she raises it above her head whenever she needs to kind of tune out the world and create her own sky and her own environment. and her own symbolic home. So Olka is definitely one of the most resonant girls in Yiddish children's literature. There are also a lot of very powerful non-protagonists, enabling mothers. The story of a stick that I mentioned, the 4-generational saga, the plot gets started when the mother of the first generation being described is critically ill, and she urges her husband to go make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and give tzedakah not only to the institutions of the Holy Land, but to go himself and distribute tzedakah in the Holy Land. And in the merit of that good deed, she recovers, but she's a very powerful figure who's not at the center of the plot, but who is really driving all of the subsequent important events that take place.
Indeed. Do you have a sense if these stories were mostly original works, or might they, earlier you were talking about the Grimm fairy tales, kind of drawing from the stories that were being told by, the people of the time. Might some of them have been rooted in common folk tales that were being adjusted for a specific audience or down to preserve them?
Yeah, so we have some of each. This is Paula Cohen's fantastic portrayal of the rabbi riding on the lion's back after they spend a miraculous Shabbos together in the desert. And that one was definitely a folk tale. It looks like a mashup of two different stories from the Maisa Buch of 1602, which, by the way, that would be another thing that families might be reading together in Yiddish. And it's all over the place as a folktale. I've seen it attested in many different versions. But a lot of these stories are being written as new stories aimed at the child who attends a modern coeducational shule or Yiddish-focused school. Yeah.
Interesting.
So it's both and.
Interesting. Okay. How would you present Yiddish to children today, a generation that hasn't even heard it spoken, and explain its value? I can really relate to this question. I was raised in a home where both of my parents spoke Yiddish. It was both their first language. They spoke Yiddish to each other. It was the secret language. And all 4 of my grandparents spoke Yiddish. And so I grew up literally, when I was a little girl, I thought that when you got old, you developed a Yiddish accent and you knew how to speak Yiddish. Like it was like genetic.
So it's important to shout out the fact that there are a lot of families that are actually raising their children. Not a lot, there are a healthy number, but they have enthusiasm far beyond their numbers. Families who are raising their children speaking Yiddish today, both in the Hasidic community and far, far outside of it. But that's not the primary market for this book. It is primarily for families who have a more truncated or attenuated connection with Yiddish. And I start the book actually with a note to the young reader where I try to explain for kids what Yiddish is and the way that it became something of a portable homeland and a way of carrying a culture that went with perhaps their forebears, perhaps their friends' forebears, all over the world, as I explained earlier, through patterns of Jewish migration. And now it's something that I'm hoping to make newly accessible for them through these translations. And the great news is that children growing up right now are growing into a world where it's more possible than it has been in decades to learn Yiddish as a college student or a young adult. There are so many summer programs and year-long programs and places where Yiddish is really thriving in, at the most rigorous levels. And so hopefully this book will also fan the interest, the little sparks of interest that some kids might be feeling. And then they'll find out that there is actually a renaissance afoot and there are all kinds of ways that they can get seriously involved in reclaiming Yiddish.
So that is actually a perfect segue to a question that somebody wrote in. As a Yiddish speaker myself, would love to share Yiddish stories with my grandchildren. This book sounds great. any chance that the stories are in English and in Yiddish? Or just in English? So the answer is the stories are only in English, but
okay, so yeah, it was impracticable to, this is a 352-page book, and NYU Press did not actually want to publish a 700-page book, half of which would be in Yiddish. However, one of the goals that I have, as soon as my breakneck pace on this virtual tour dies down a little bit, is to put together a teaching guide where I collate all the scans. Every text in this book is on the website of the Yiddish Book Center. The titles, the original titles, are all in the back. So if you are enterprising and have the time, you can go onto the Yiddish Book Center website yourself and search for them. But one of the projects that I would like to do when I get a little more time and a little more childcare is to collate all of the PDFs of the Yiddish originals. And NYU Press has said that that can live on their website once I get it together.
That would be incredible. Maybe there's some lovely graduate student who can do that for you, because you're never going to have time. Okay. Can you speak more to this? There may not be gender equality in terms of the volume of output in Yiddish literature, but there is no doubt about the parity in quality. Agree, disagree, expand.
Totally agree. Totally agree. You're not going to find a more skillful practitioner than Sina Rabinovich, who really understood how to tell a story and keep it moving and talk to kids. I would say that although we don't have a lot by Rochel Shabbat, what we have, the story Gur Aryeh, is a real folktale, fairy tale. And it's excellent. So yeah, I think that the quality is there. And then of course, Kadia Molodovsky, you know, that she sort of speaks for herself. She is one of the better known figures. I would say that the two kind of household or near household names in the volume are Kadia Molodovsky and Sholem Ash. And her stories are just beautifully crafted.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more. I'm taking back my moderator prerogative, because I do want to make sure we touch on the illustrations, which are just beautiful and whimsical and delightful in every way. And they're definitely a piece of the reason that I called the book delicious was the illustrations. So how did you find this illustrator, and how did the process work of illustrating the book?
Sure. So I knew all along that I wanted to have illustrations, and I really wanted them to be in color. And we actually delayed the publication of the book by a year as I tried to fundraise toward that purpose. And I couldn't really sell anybody on the amount of money that it would have taken to print in color. But one of the very fortuitous things that happened over that last year was that there's a program at the Yiddish Book Center called Tent, which brought together contemporary authors and illustrators of Jewish children's literature, mostly in English and in Hebrew. Some Israelis came who were working in Hebrew. And this program ran for 3 years, from 2017 to 2019. And I was fortunate to be able to teach in it all 3 times. And the 3rd year, there was somebody who had been a participant the 2nd year, and then she just came back to do her own residency during that week. And she was friends with Paula Cohen. And so Paula Cohen heard me teach and give my quick world tour of Yiddish children's literature. And she was talking to her friend, the novelist Joanne Levy. And Joanne said, I'm pretty sure Miriam is still looking for an illustrator. So she acted as the good classic Jewish matchmaker. And Paula really wanted to work on it. I took one look at her work and I knew that we would be so fortunate if we could get her and come to terms with her. So Emory's Tam Institute of Jewish Studies came through with very generous funding. We also got some subvention funds from my alma mater, from the Department of Comparative Literature at Harvard. And after many emails and even one particularly chutzpahdik phone call to the art director, who had never, ever heard directly from an author before, and I think was just sort of like flummoxed into I don't know. I don't know what. But after all of that holy chutzpah, we got to Yes. And Paula made these incredible, the cover is her work, and it's just beautiful. It references several of the situations in the various stories. She made 8 full-page illustrations to open each of those 8 thematic sections. And then she made these glorious little spot illustrations that go in banners at the beginning of each story. So each one has an object that figures prominently in that story. And we were also able to include a lot of the original black and white illustrations, most of which are line drawings or woodblock prints.
That was going to be my next question. Did you use any of the original artwork from the original books? That's wonderful. So you spoke about who this, we're running near or close to the 1 o'clock hour, but I'm going to try to get in at least 1 or 2 more questions.
Sure.
You spoke about who the stories were intended for. You know who actually read them? How widely were they distributed?
So that's something that that I will be trying to figure out next time I have a research fellowship, and access to some archival resources, because I am trying to figure out, we don't have good figures, we don't have good record keeping. So I'm going to be trying to deploy some indirect methods of figuring out who was influenced by these stories. So, stay tuned for more on that. It's a great question, and one that I'm in the process of trying to ask.
Awesome. Okay, so our last question is, what are the gateway drug stories in this book? Meaning, for the reader out there who's going to buy this book for her grandchildren, for her children, for whatever, a bat mitzvah gift, whatever it is, what are the stories that you think will best start the love of Yiddish literature for today's young person?
Sure. So, of course, I love all of them, or they wouldn't be in my book. But my editor was very strategic. I guess he anticipated this question. He's more experienced than I. And he suggested that each of those 8 thematic sections, start and end with a really strong work. And so I'm just looking at the table of contents now and thinking, yeah, that checks out. I think we did a pretty good job.
That's actually useful.
If a child read the first and last story in each section, I think they would not go wrong with that.
I love that. I'm really glad I asked that question. Okay. And our last question, as it is 12:56, and then we'll wrap up. How would you argue that Yiddish literature should be a Jewish educational priority as part of our historic and literary heritage? And I have to tell you, this question resonates an enormous amount for me, as someone who kind of came to a love of Yiddish culture and language as an adult in my graduate work. So should it be a Jewish educational priority? Why?
So fortunately, since we only have 3 minutes left, I gave an entire Eli talk on this topic, which you can
Great.
go on YouTube or on my website, miriamudel.com. But essentially, Yiddish encodes the record of the Jewish confrontation with modernity. And if we think that we're still having that confrontation, if we want to understand what it looks like to be an observant Jew, or to have Jewish religious engagement in an era of tremendous secularization and secularity, then we really need Yiddish. We're shooting ourselves in the foot if we lose access to Yiddish.
I love that. I actually think that that's a perfect place to conclude. And I just thank you so much. This was such a delightful conversation. And I know that the 50 people we have on the call enjoyed it just as much as I did. I want to just share with you, let's see, can we share our email so people can follow up? Okay, so I'm sure, Miriam, you can be reached through your website, I'm imagining.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
And I can be reached at laurashawfrank@gmail.com. Nice and easy. It's just my name at Gmail, no punctuation, none of that. This was an incredible conversation. I am just delighted to have had it, and also really eager to go back and now read the rest of the stories that I haven't yet read. Every one of them is a treasure.
Thank you. And do we have links for purchasing the book? If you...
Yes, Ariella will be putting that link in just a moment. I just wanted, on behalf of Maharat and Svivah and JOFA, to express such a tremendous amount of gratitude to the two of you. I mean, I think this conversation, if everyone on this call was not already in ownership of your book, then I hope that we've all placed our orders or will be placing them soon. And if you didn't get to in your RSVP for today, there was an opportunity to put in your address if you want a book plate from Darshanit Udel. So that if you did not get to do that, feel free to email any of us and we will be happy to help connect you with that special one-time offer, personalized book plate.
And bookmark featuring Sprinze.
Even better. I know I certainly will be handing this book over to my avid reader 7-year-old to enjoy together as a family. Thank you both so much. Thank you to JOFA, for Danny, for running the tech on the back end, to Ariella for making sure that everyone is engaged and enjoying the chat feature. And we are just so grateful to all of you for being with us here today.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Everybody.